In this video, we're going to look at what is a monopoly and why do they exist. Well, a monopoly is defined as a market in which you have a single company that is the one and only seller or supplier. But identifying a monopoly is not that easy because we have to look at what do we mean by the market. Markets are where buyers and sellers come together. But how you define the market will really determine whether or not you have a monopoly. So for example, let's say you live in a small town that has one traffic light. You probably also have one grocery store and one gas station. That one gas station, if we look at just your town, is a monopoly, right? No competition because they're the only gas station in town. But if we expand our market to be all of Alberta, then we start to see a lot more different brands, different companies that provide gas. And so there's more competition. So now we have an oligopoly, a handful of sellers. If we expand globally, then there's a lot more competition. So how you define the market matters in terms of whether or not you have that definition of a monopoly, a single firm selling particular goods or services. What we want to look at today is how do monopolies come into existence? Now, what we'll look at in the next video is what does it mean to act like a monopoly? So when it comes to antitrust law, government regulations about competition, what they care about is whether companies are acting like monopolies. So we'll look at what that means and how monopolies set prices and quantities in the next video. But in this video, let's look at how does a monopoly come into existence? So let's look at some examples of monopolies. Your monopolies can be government granted. For example, the East India Company came into existence in 1600, and it was created by the British government. So the British government said the East India Company is the only company allowed to collect cotton, silk, indigo, tea, and opium from India and sell it to England. The Hudson Bay Company, similar, came into existence as a government-granted monopoly. The Hudson Bay Company was given the exclusive rights to buy pelts and merchandise from what is now Canada and sell that to England. In fact, the Hudson Bay Company is one of the oldest continually operating companies in the world. So your monopoly can come into existence because the government grants you the rights to be the only seller. Hudson Bay Company, the East India Company are examples of this. You can also become a monopoly by keeping out the competition. So for example, a Standard Oil controlled 91% of the production of kerosene, the primary source for lighting and energy, and they had 91% of the production in 1904. Okay. Now, the Standard Oil was owned by John D. Rockefeller, and we've all heard of John D. Rockefeller, right? We know about Rockefeller Plaza in New York City. Well, Standard Oil wanted to keep out the competition. They wanted to be the one to be the sole provider of kerosene. And so what they would do is they would team up, because John D. Rockefeller was friends with a lot of the owners of railroad companies. And so Standard Oil teamed up with the railroad companies to keep the competition out. The railroad companies mandated that pipelines could not go under their tracks, their railroad tracks, unless you were Standard Oil. Only Standard Oil could run pipe under the railroad tracks. Well, think about how many railroad tracks there are across this country and across the U.S. Is it logistically possible that you could run pipe, and then every time you hit a railroad track, you have to pull it out from under the ground, you'd have to pull the oil out, you'd have to put it in containers, you'd have to truck it across the railroad tracks, put it back into the pipeline, and send it on its way? Well, there's so many sets of tracks that this would just be impossible to do. It would be so cost prohibitive. And so exactly, it kept the competition out of the market. Well, The US was not very happy about this practice. Why? Because the less competition, what happens? Well, if you have no competitors, then you can drive up the price. And so it kept up the price of oil at the expense of the customer. So the US actually created the Sherman Antitrust Act. And what that did is it actually took Standard Oil and divided it up into a number of smaller companies. And these are the oil companies you know today: ExxonMobil, Chevron, and so on. So we have monopolies that exist because the government created them. We have monopolies that exist because they kept out the competition. Another example of monopoly would be, well, according to the European Union, in 2003, Microsoft was found guilty of monopolistic practices, of behaving like a monopoly and keeping out the competition. So the charge against Microsoft was that they were participating in anti-competitive behavior because their products came with the Microsoft-created web browser, right, Internet Explorer, and they made it very difficult to install other web browsers and for the other web browsers to become the default. Okay, so some argue this is the downfall of Netscape Navigator, a web browser you probably never heard of because it didn't live for very long. Well, in 2003, the European Union charged Microsoft, found them guilty of anti-competitive practices. Now, Microsoft argued at these hearings that they couldn't be a monopoly. It was all about how you define the market, right? They couldn't be a monopoly because they did have competition like Apple computers. So as long as Apple computers existed, they weren't a monopoly. So how are you defining the market? Is the market the Microsoft products, in which case different software can go on, or is the market computers, in which case you have Microsoft products and you have Apple products? Well, later in 2003, Microsoft bought 150,000 non-voting shares of Apple. Okay, so one of the largest owners of Apple is Microsoft. Why? Because as long as Apple exists, then Microsoft can argue that they're not a monopoly. So Microsoft sits on the board of Apple. They know what Apple is planning on doing, but they don't vote on there. So that Microsoft is ensured that they're not a monopoly by helping make sure their competitor continues to thrive. So let's talk about really where monopolies come from. So monopolies come into existence because we have barriers to entry. So remember, in a perfectly competitive market, there are no barriers to entry. So you could join in if you saw others making economic profit, and you could get out if you weren't making economic profit in the long run. Well, monopolies exist because we have barriers to entry. And there are three general barriers to entry: technical barriers, legal barriers, and economic barriers. So let's look at each one of these. So let's start with our technical barriers. So a technical barrier is created when your company is the only one with access to the raw materials. So, for example, when it comes to diamonds, De Beers has 90% of the world's diamond mines. And in fact, in Canada just this year, there was a Canadian-owned diamond mine that De Beers just bought. So they've been increasingly consolidating their ownership over the market. So if De Beers is the only one who has access to diamonds, then of course they're going to be the only supplier. They're going to be a monopoly. Now, what happens when you're the only one with access to the raw materials? Well, others can't join in and start up a business because they don't have access to the raw materials. And what we see the impact of this is that De Beers intentionally reduces the quantity of diamonds that go onto the market, and this helps keep the price of diamonds high. The other way you can have a technical barrier is that only you know how to do something. So if you know how to do something that no one else does, then it's difficult for others to join in the market. For example, in the 1960s, IBM was essentially the only company providing computing services. At the time, a computer, which does less than your cell phone, would be about the size of a room, like a classroom. But only IBM knew how to build this computer, and so they had a monopoly. Now, the challenge is that if you have a monopoly based on knowledge or techniques, it is short-lived. Right? Because someone could buy an IBM computer, take it apart, learn how it works, and then they could build their own and become a competitor. Whereas if you have access to the raw materials, then this is going to be a much longer-lived monopoly because it's much harder for others to gain access to those materials. And so De Beers essentially has had a monopoly over diamonds for over 100 years. Whereas IBM, having a monopoly in computers, it lasted about a decade, and then we start to see more and more competitors, and now you don't even see a lot of IBM-based computers anymore. So technical barriers is the first in terms of barriers to entry that can create monopolies. The second barrier to entry are legal barriers. So this is where the barrier is created by the government. Now you remember, in our previous discussions, we talked about how sometimes competition is inefficient or wasteful. If competition is inefficient or wasteful, then products that we could have as private, leaving up to the market for supply and demand, setting the price and quantity, we could instead treat like public. And public goods we have either fully funded or partially funded through taxes, and the government provides them. Well, if competition is inefficient or wasteful, then one way to ensure that the good or service is still provided is for the government to be the monopoly or to appoint a company to be the monopoly. So think about this. Mail, right? Why do we have the Canada Post? Well, what if you live in a remote location in Nunavut? It's not cost effective for a profit-driven company to provide mail to that location, right? You'd be paying like $50 for a postcard because of all the logistical costs to get it there. But how do we make sure that people in Nunavut are still getting the government mail, right? So maybe they need information for their taxes. Maybe we're making sure that they get notifications. How do we make sure that, your letter gets to grandma? Well, in order to ensure that people in all locations have access to mail, then we can't have it be a profit-driven company. Instead, we have the government be the company, and then we use economies of scale. That is, because the government is the one company across the entire country, then the costs, the infrastructure costs, the sorting, we can spread out that transit cost across multiple locations. So remember, economies of scale means that the more you produce, the lower the per unit cost. And so we can spread that out across all of the letters going across Canada, not just the cost of a single letter to Nunavut. So if the government is the monopoly, then we have what is called a crown corporation. So Canada Post is a crown corporation, CBC, or the Canadian Broadcasting Company, they're a crown corporation. In other words, the government is the monopoly. Okay. We can also have the government grant a monopoly to a particular company. So let's look at an example, and that would be fueling airplanes. Okay. So in Vietnam, for example, the company that was providing fuel for airplanes was a company called Vanapco. Okay. So why would you do this? Why would you have the government grant a monopoly? Well, the government grants a monopoly when there's security issues, for example, right? We don't want just anybody putting fuel in airplanes, After September 11th, right, we have concerns about security in terms of people getting access to airplanes, and the more different companies you have providing this, the harder it is to control that security issue. Well, in this particular case, in Vietnam, the challenge is that VNAPCO wanted to get paid more. And so what they told the airlines is they weren't going to refuel the planes until VNAPCO got more money. What's the problem with this? Well, essentially, you're holding the country hostage because there's no fuel being put into any planes because the government had granted the monopoly to this one company, and this one company was refusing to fuel the planes until they got paid more. Well, in this case, in 2009, the Vietnamese government decided, well, maybe we shouldn't have just one company refueling planes. Maybe we should open it up and have a handful more companies so that competition prevented one company from preventing air traffic. But if we look at other examples, you can't just open your own nuclear power plant. There's government regulations there. That creates barriers, and those barriers are created by the government and restricts the number of companies that can be the sellers. So in terms of barriers created by the government, we do it because competition is inefficient or wasteful. We do it because there is some kind of licensing requirements. We need to basically have more government oversight. And the third reason that the government would create a legal barrier would be to encourage research and development. So when we look at patents and copyrights create a temporary monopoly. Well, why do we put patents on drugs? The reason that drug companies get a patent for a certain amount of time, it means that they can recoup some of the costs in terms of coming up with the drug. If they immediately had lots of competition, then that would make prices go down, and so then they wouldn't make as much profit, and profit is what is used for developing that new drug. You need that profit so that for a period of time you can put money into creating a new product that may or may not work. Okay? Well, patents don't last forever. We have patents expire. If we look at, for example, in 2018, Cialis will expire, Lyrica, which is for nerve pain, Restasis for dry eye, Advair for asthma, Neulasta for blood cell production. These drugs will expire. When they expire, then it comes open to competition. And so we want it to be open to competition to drive down the price for the customer. But we also need a period of time where there's less competition to encourage these companies to do research and development. And we can see the impact of this if we look at Canada versus the US. So in the US, a patent on drugs like the ones we've just discussed is about 20 years. In Canada, the drugs patents are about 10 years. Well, if your patent is shorter, what impact will that have on pharmaceutical companies' decisions as to what they will do in your country versus others? Well, what we see is that in Canada, there is less research and development. So pharmaceutical companies, they do their research and development in the US. They release the drugs first to the US. And then after a number of years, they will eventually make it to Canada. And then the patents will expire at the same time in Canada and the US. So the shorter your patent period, the less likely the companies are to invest in new products because they're not going to receive as much profit. That means for your country, it takes longer for the drugs to get here as well. All right, so in terms of barriers, we had technical barriers, we had legal barriers, and the third is economic barriers. So economic barriers are barriers that exist because of economies of scale. And so let's think about economies of scale. So as our company produces a greater and greater quantity, our long-run average cost curve declines. So when you double your inputs, you get more than double your output. Your per unit cost is falling. And we've looked earlier this semester at how you can achieve economies of scale. Economies of scale, right? When you do things like divisions of labor, the fact that you don't have to specialize your or the fact that you can specialize your departments, right? I don't have to double the accounting department and the marketing department to produce twice as much stuff, so the cost per unit will fall. I can do things like buy in bulk and sell in bulk. Those will help me achieve economies of scale. The bigger my company, the cheaper it is to borrow. Those things create economies of scale. Well, when we look at the existence of monopolies, what we call natural monopolies exist because they can get bigger and bigger and bigger and continue to achieve economies of scale. That long-run average cost curve declines for a large quantity. And so these are companies that have real big startup costs, real big fixed costs. So think about utility companies. So if I wanted to start a power plant based on hydroelectric, right? I'm going to need to build a dam. There's going to be a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built. Well, that's a big fixed cost. And so the more I produce, the more I can take those millions of dollars, billions of dollars that are put into that big fixed cost, and I can spread them out. So my long run average fixed cost keeps going down and down and down. So what we tend to see is power companies like New Brunswick Power, BC Hydro, these utility companies, they tend to be monopolies. And the reason is because they need a large customer base to get that per unit cost down. So you think about it. If you had a hydroelectric power plant and you had one customer, then that one customer would have to pay billions of dollars. But if we can have millions of customers, then the cost of the power gets a lot smaller. Okay? So any company with large startup costs, big large fixed costs, big infrastructure, that's going to have economies of scale up to large quantities, and it makes sense for them to be a natural monopoly. And we can look here. So if at small quantities, the cost per unit is very high, at large quantities, the cost per unit is much lower. So as a society, if there is economies of scale to be had, we would rather the companies get bigger. Because if we can get the company to get their per unit costs go down, then we should be able to sell the product at a price much lower to the customer as well. So the customer benefits from a natural monopoly if that cost savings and that lower per unit cost gets passed on to the customer in terms of lower prices. Now, it's not a guarantee when you have a monopoly because there's not competition driving down price. So often we have some kind of overseeing body, some kind of commission that is going to make sure that the per unit cost is lower. So for example, when it comes to cable, to television, we have the Canadian Radio and Television Commission, and they're to make sure that this cost savings gets passed on to the customer. In Alberta, we have the Alberta Utilities Commission to make sure that the energy companies are passing on that savings that they get from having less competition and producing at a larger quantity, so their per unit cost goes down, that gets passed on to the customer. Okay, so if you have a natural monopoly, you need to make sure that this low cost also goes on to the customer in terms of low prices. So either you have an overseeing body, like the CRTC or the AUC, and they have to get approved. The utility companies, or we talk about Shaw and TELUS, they have to get approval when they want to change their prices. They have to get approval by these commissions. So that's one option to make sure that this low cost gets passed on to the customer. The other is to have the government be that monopoly, in which case you have a crown corporation. So we like natural monopolies because the per unit costs are lower, but we need to make sure that per unit cost gets passed on to the customer and lower prices as well. So you can see here on this graph, we can see because of that continually declining long-run average cost curve, you could have two companies provide this energy here, right? So we could have two firms, and they're each going to provide 2 million kilowatts per hour. And if they do that, then according to that long-run average cost curve, the cost is going to be 10 cents a kilowatt. But if instead of having two companies each producing a smaller quantity, and therefore at a higher cost, if we had one company producing all 4 million kilowatts of energy, you can see according to the long-run average cost curve that they could do it for just 5 cents a kilowatt instead of 10. So here, it's a benefit to have a monopoly instead of have competition because of that economies of scale, because the long-run average cost curve keeps declining. But again, we have to make sure that that cost savings gets passed on to the customer in terms of lower prices. Now, when we talk about monopolies, we said the definition of a monopoly is one seller. But in reality, when we look at the different types of markets, it's a continuum. Somewhere between perfect competition, where we have thousands of sellers, and a monopoly, where we have one seller. And so it's quite possible for a company to fall somewhere in between. And that's why we're going to look at in the next video, do they act like a monopoly? So we can say that a company is a natural monopoly even when it has competition. For example, Microsoft has about 83% of the market share when it comes to operating systems. There are other operating systems like Apple, okay? But when they're so small in comparison, then Microsoft can act like a monopoly. Okay, and we'll talk about what does it mean to act like a monopoly in the next video. It's how you set price and quantity. Well, why does Microsoft end up as a monopoly? Well, because when it comes to developing computers and software, all of the cost is in the initial creation, right? So just like the pharmaceutical companies with the research and development, coming up with new technology and new way to deliver information, that's a lot of cost up front. And so then when you go and provide one more copy of the operating system to people, especially since we don't even put things on CDs anymore, it's a download, right? So the cost of distribution, the cost of selling one more unit is so tiny. So we have that long-run average cost curve that continues to decline, that economies of scale. So natural monopolies have a very small marginal cost. The extra cost to make one more unit, to sell one more copy of the operating system is teeny tiny. What they have is a big fixed cost. A lot of big cost up front. And so the more you produce, the more you can spread that out. Other examples of natural monopolies would be eBay, right? They have about 76% of the market share. Search engines like Google. Google has 91% of the market share. The costs are all in the initial startup, and providing one more auction on eBay, to do one more search on Google, the extra cost, the marginal cost, is minuscule. And so the companies get bigger and bigger and bigger, and those per unit costs go down.